cold. Michael was the first to feel it, a penetrating chill seeping under his skin, making every cell in his body tremble in helpless resistance. Then pain. It throbbed at the back of his head, echoed in his temples, and spread throughout his body, concentrating especially in his wrists, tightly bound with rough rope. He struggled to open his eyes, his eyelids, swollen from insect bites, barely lifted. Twilight slowly consumed the vast forests, turning the trees into ominous silhouettes. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a mournful cry, and that sound only emphasized the hopelessness of his situation. "This is it," Michael whispered, his lips parched, when he finally managed to spit out the blood-soaked rag that had been stuffed into his mouth. "This is where my story ends." The 45-year-old park ranger for the Whispering Pines National Park lay on the damp forest floor where Poachers had left him. His hands and feet were tightly bound behind his back, his face scratched by branches and swollen from insect bites. Every attempt to move sent a fresh wave of pain through him. Every breath felt like molten lead pouring into his lungs. His thoughts blurred, consciousness flickered, returning only to slip away again into darkness. In one such moment of clarity, Michael realized the inevitable. He would die here, in these woods he had sworn to protect. He would become food for the very creatures to whom he had dedicated the last 7 years of his life. "Ironic," he scoffed, and the smirk sent a sharp pain through his split lip. The howl echoed again, closer this time. The sound rolled through the forest, silencing birds and small creatures. Michael knew that voice. He recognized that tone, and the realization made his heart clench with a strange mix of fear and dread. "Before we begin, please tell us what city you're from. Subscribe, hit like, and watch until the end. Here we go." Alex Prohoroff nervously drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his battered old SUV as the GPS stubbornly showed 87 miles remaining to his destination. The gravel road meandered between towering pines, occasionally giving way to ruts filled with puddles that made the 35-year-old journalist for the Evening Star City Gazette newspaper press back into his seat, silently cursing his profession. "Darn editor-in-chief," Alex muttered, swerving around another pothole. "Go to the park. There's a great story there. And they could have warned me about the road." He grumbled mostly out of habit, though. In truth, this assignment actually seemed interesting. After all, it wasn't every day you got to interview a man saved from death by a wild wolf. The story of Michael Johnson, a park ranger for Whispering Pines National Park, had caused a stir throughout the region 3 years ago. All the local newspapers had reported on it, but details were sparse. Poachers, an attack, a miraculous rescue, just dry facts, terse comments from officials. And now, with the fuss having died down, Alex decided to write an in-depth feature for the Unusual Destinies column. "Probably all made up," he mused aloud, addressing the forest outside his window. "Most likely, the ranger freed himself and invented the wolf story for dramatic effect. But readers will love it either way." The car hit a bump, and Alex's head struck the ceiling. "Blast it! Almost there." He checked the GPS. "All right, 5 more miles." Northridge, a small settlement bordering the park, greeted the journalist with dilapidated wooden houses and suspicious glances from the few passers-by. The place looked abandoned, as if stuck in a time warp somewhere between an old mining town past and an uncertain future. Alex pulled up to the only store, which looked more like a large shed. Above the door hung a faded sign that read, "General Store." "Excuse me," he addressed the elderly woman behind the counter. "I'm looking for Mr. Michael Johnson's house, the park ranger." The woman gave him a scrutinizing look. "And who might you be to him?" "Alex Prohorov, a journalist from the Evening Star City Gazette. I have an appointment for an interview." "Ah, Alex," the shopkeeper said, her face softening a little. "You're here for Michael, then? He lives on the outskirts, right by the forest. See the house with the green roof? That's his? Thank you so much. Just mind you," the woman added, as Alex turned to leave, "he doesn't much care to talk about that incident. So be careful with your questions, won't you?" Alex nodded and stepped outside. The house with the green roof turned out to be a small but sturdy cabin surrounded by a tall fence. A sign reading, "Beware of Dog," hung by the gate, but no barking was heard. The journalist hesitated before knocking. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps behind the fence, and the gate opened. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in his 50s with short graying hair and watchful gray eyes. His broad shoulders and straight posture suggested a former military man, and a deep scar crossing his left cheek from temple to chin gave his appearance a stern quality. "Mr. Johnson?" Alex confirmed. "I'm Prohorov, the journalist. We had an appointment." "I remember," the ranger nodded. "Come in." The yard was clean and well kept. To the right, neatly stacked firewood. To the left, vegetable patches. On the porch, a large, fluffy husky lay dozing, merely opening one eye at the sight of the guest, and, finding no threat in the newcomer, dozed off again. "Come inside," Michael invited, and Alex followed him into the cool entrance hall, then into a bright living room with a large table and an old sofa against the wall. "Tea?" the host asked. "I'd love some." Michael went to the kitchen, and the journalist looked around. The room was simply furnished but tastefully decorated. On the walls were nature photographs, apparently taken by the host himself. A bookshelf was filled with classics and books about wildlife. In the corner was a small niche with framed photos. Returning with tea and homemade cookies, Michael sat opposite him. "So, what exactly interests you?" Alex took out his voice recorder. "If you don't mind, I'll record our conversation." Michael nodded. "I'm interested in your story. The whole thing. From start to finish. How you ended up in the park, what happened with the poachers and the wolf, what came after." The ranger paused, took a sip of tea, and quietly said, "It's a long story." "I have plenty of time," Alex smiled. "All right," Michael nodded. "Then let's start from the beginning." "I wasn't born here," Michael began, looking past the journalist. "I'm from a manufacturing town in the Midwest. My father worked at the steel mill. My mother was a school teacher, a normal family. After high school, I went to military academy, then service, deployments, Korea, the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan." He paused, taking a sip of tea. "I finished my service as a major, with medals and commendations. And then something happened that turned my whole life upside down." The ranger stood, walked to the bookshelf, and took out a framed photograph. It showed a young woman with a teenage girl. Both were smiling. "My wife Anne and my daughter Katie," he said quietly. "This is the last photo, taken a week before the accident." "I'm so sorry," Alex said sincerely. "It was my fault," Michael continued. "I was driving. We were coming back from the lake house, and it was raining heavily. A semi-truck swerved into our lane." He fell silent again. They died instantly. All I got was a broken leg and this scar. The ranger ran a hand over his cheek. Well, in short, my personal hell began. Alcohol, pills, nightmares. I was on the brink. Doctors diagnosed PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The combat, the loss of my family, it all piled up. I saw no point in living anymore. Michael returned the photograph to the shelf and sat back down at the table. And then my old comrade in arms, Andrew Stevens, he's now the director of Whispering Pines National Park, offered me a job. He said, "Michael, you need a change of scenery. Get away from people, from the city, from the memories. Start a new life." That's how I ended up here, in this remote wilderness. Alex nodded, making notes in his notepad. "At first it was hard," the ranger continued. "I had to get used to the solitude, to the forests, to the new job. But gradually it got easier. I felt like I was becoming one with nature. Every morning, patrolling the territory. Every day, new tracks, new encounters with animals. Foxes, deer, bears, and wolves." Michael smiled, the first time in their entire conversation. "You know, I always thought of wolves as ruthless predators. We fear them so much, demonize them, but in reality, they just live by their own laws. They have their own morality, their own ethics. And sometimes it turns out to be higher than human morality." "Are you talking about that incident?" the journalist asked carefully. "Yes," Michael nodded. "But before I tell you about it, we need to go back a couple of years, to my first encounter with her, the wolf that later saved my life." "It was June 2015, Michael began, leaning back in his chair. "I'd been working at the park for a couple of years by then. I was doing a routine patrol of the southern sector. That's about 15 miles from here, near Black Creek." The ranger poured himself more tea and continued, "It was a hot, muggy day. The forest was eerily silent. Even the birds had fallen quiet. I was walking along the trail beside the stream, checking trail cameras, when I suddenly heard a strange sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Michael closed his eyes, remembering. I cautiously moved towards the sound, pushed aside some bushes, and saw her, a gray wolf, large, mature, tangled in a poacher's snare. You see, poachers set these snares for big game, deer, wild boar, but often other animals get caught too. Alex listened intently, without interrupting. "She was in a terrible state," the ranger continued. "The wire was digging into her neck, her fur matted with blood, and nearby—" He paused. "Nearby sat 3 cubs, very young, about 2 or 3 months old, hungry, exhausted. They were trying to nurse, but there was no milk, apparently. The wolf hadn't eaten for several days." "And what did you do?" the journalist asked. "You know, in a situation like that, there's a protocol," Michael replied. "I should have called a special team from the park headquarters, waited for them, immobilized the animal with a tranquilizer, and then freed it. But," he shook his head, "but I saw. She only had hours left. She wouldn't make it until a team arrived." Michael stood and walked to the window. "I made a decision instantly. I would act alone. I had a tranquilizer with me, but in her state, it might have just killed her. I risked doing without it. I slowly approached, speaking in a calm voice. 'Easy, girl, easy, I'll help.' She looked at me, with a gaze that sent shivers down my spine. It held everything, fear, rage, pleading, and understanding, as if she knew this was her last chance." "Weren't you scared?" Alex asked. "After all, a wounded predator, and one protecting its young—" "Scared?" Michael scoffed. after what I saw in combat. But yes, the adrenaline was certainly pumping. One wrong move, and she could have torn my throat out despite her condition. A mother's instinct is a powerful force. The ranger returned to the table. I took out my knife and slowly began to cut the wire, trying not to make any sudden movements. The wolf never took her eyes off me, but she didn't try to bite. When the snare was cut, she couldn't stand up immediately. She was too weak. I backed up to a safe distance and watched. After a few minutes, she rose on trembling legs, licked each cub, and slowly limped into the woods. The cubs followed her. Michael closed his eyes again. And you know what was the strangest thing? Before disappearing into the thicket, she turned and looked at me, right into my eyes. It was a unique gaze, as if she wanted to say, "I remember you, human." He opened his eyes and looked at the journalist. "I've encountered wild animals many times in the forest, but that gaze, it was almost human. I thought then, no, I imagined it. But later I realized I hadn't." Alex took a sip of his now cold tea. "And what happened next? Did you see that wolf again?" "Briefly." Michael nodded. "I saw her from a distance a few times, with binoculars. I watched the cubs grow. They stayed within the territory of their den, about 2 miles from where I freed her. The wolf grew stronger, hunted successfully, and about a year later, the cubs separated, moved on. That's normal. Young wolves form their own families, establish new territories." "And that's when the story with the poachers happened," Alex clarified. "No," the ranger shook his head. "Another whole year passed before that. The incident with the poachers happened in the summer of 2017. By that time, I knew my section of the park well," Michael continued after a short pause. "Every trail, every stream. I knew where specific animals lived, which birds nested. A park ranger's job is constant observation, gathering information. I had a map where I marked all changes, new game trails, fallen trees, signs of human presence." He sighed. "That day, it was early July, I noticed tire tracks deep in the woods where they shouldn't have been. In the park, there are designated roads for rangers and scientific staff. But these tracks led off the authorized routes towards Round Lake. It's teeming with fish, and poachers often go there despite regulations and fines." Alex listened without interrupting, only occasionally making notes in his pad. "I followed the tracks," Michael continued. "It was around noon, hot. Suddenly I heard gunshots. 1, 2, 3. That's a serious violation. Hunting is absolutely forbidden in the park at any time of year. I contacted headquarters on the radio, reported the situation, and said I was going to investigate." The ranger took a sip of tea. "By the book, I should have waited for backup. But the nearest outpost was almost a 2-hour drive away, and if poachers had, say, killed a deer, they'd have time to butcher the carcass and be gone. So I decided to act alone." He looked at the photograph of his wife and daughter on the shelf. "You know, I used to be more cautious, but after their death stopped frightening me. On the contrary, sometimes it felt like it would bring relief. That's why I often took risks, acted alone." "And what happened next?" Alex asked. "I moved towards the gunshots, trying to be quiet," Michael continued. "About half an hour later, I came out onto a small clearing by the lake and saw them. 3 men, all armed, with an SUV nearby. On the grass was the carcass of a doe, and next to it a small fawn, killed separately. Do you understand? They weren't just poaching, they were killing for sport." The ranger's face hardened. I stepped into the clearing, introduced myself, demanded their IDs and firearms permits, knowing full well they wouldn't have any. The older one, the one they called Sam, started to dissemble, saying they were lost, thought they were outside the park boundaries. The typical excuse, I told them I'd called the patrol and now they'd have to wait for them to arrive and then face the law. Michael paused. And then I made an unforgivable mistake. I turned my back to them to radio in my coordinates, and at that moment I got hit in the head with a rifle butt. He automatically touched the back of his head. I woke up already bound. They were debating what to do with me. The older one, Sam, suggested just leaving tied up, saying eventually someone would find me. But one of the younger ones with tattoos on his arms objected. He saw us, he remembered. We can't leave a witness. Alex tensed. They wanted to kill you? Yes, Michael answered simply. The tattooed one suggested taking care of it right there and then. Fortunately, Sam was against it. We came here to hunt, not to murder. In the end, they agreed to leave me tied up in the wilderness, gagged, without food or water. Nature would take its course. Within a couple of days, from thirst, hunger, and insect bites, I wouldn't survive. The ranger shook his head. They were right in their calculations. Surviving in that position is practically impossible. But you survived, Alex noted. Yes, Michael nodded. Thanks to her. The poachers drove me far from where they'd captured me, Michael continued, about 15 miles. It was a remote part of the forest, where even rangers rarely venture. They tossed me under a sprawling spruce tree, searched me, took my knife, radio, phone, even my watch, and drove off. I heard the roar of their engine fade, and then silence fell, a terrifying, ringing silence of the forest that usually feels so vibrant and full of sounds. The ranger stood, stretching his shoulders. At first, I tried to free myself. I writhed, tried to rub the ropes against tree roots, dislocated my shoulder, all useless. They knew their business well. They'd tied me professionally, like they teach in the military. I couldn't dislodge the gag either. It was deep and tied with a rag. As darkness fell, despair set in. Michael returned to the table. You know what's scariest in a situation like that? Not death itself, no, but the realization of your helplessness. You lie there, completely immobilized, and all around you is the forest with all its dangers. You hear every rustle, every snap of a twig, and your imagination paints the most horrific pictures. A bear that will simply tear you apart, a wild boar that will trample you, a pack of wolves. He gave a bleak chuckle. Irony of fate, isn't it? Alex nodded, not interrupting the story. I barely slept the first night, the ranger continued. I listened to every sound, flinched at every rustle. The gag in my mouth was soaked with blood. I'd split my lip when they hit me, and that blood attracted insects. They crawled over my face, into my nostrils, into my ears. I couldn't shoo them away, couldn't even turn my head. I was tied that tightly. Michael took a sip of tea. By morning, I was covered in bites. My face was so swollen that my eyes were almost shut. A fever started, either from the bites or from infection in the wounds. I would drift into unconsciousness, then come back to myself. In one of those moments of clarity, I remembered my predecessor, another ranger who had disappeared 3 years ago. His body was never found. Now I understood that most likely the same thing had happened to him. Michael rubbed his face with his palms as if trying to erase the memories. The second day was worse than the first. Thirst. Do you know what real thirst is like? It's when your tongue swells, your lips crack until they bleed, and your throat feels like it's filled with hot sand. A scorching day, the sun filtered through the branches, mercilessly baking me. Besides, he faltered, I had soiled myself, couldn't hold it. The smell attracted even more insects. Humiliating, agonizing. At one point I even prayed for death, just for it all to end. The ranger fell silent, lost in his memories. Alex didn't rush him, understanding how difficult this story was to tell. By the evening of the second day, Michael finally continued, I was at my breaking point. My mind was clouded. In my head, fragments of memories, the faces of my wife and daughter, my comrades in arms. I talked to them, asked for forgiveness. At one point, I thought I had already died, and this was my personal hell. Michael looked out the window. And then the second night came. I drifted in and out of consciousness, and in one of those moments of waking, I felt a presence. You know how a hunter senses they are being watched. It was exactly like that. I struggled to open my swollen eyes and saw a silhouette. At first I thought it was a hallucination, a deathbed delusion, but then I felt hot breath on my cheek. It was her, Michael whispered, my wolf, large gray with a white patch on her chest. I recognized her immediately, even through my clouded consciousness. She stood over me, sniffing. I thought, this is it, the end. Now she'll tear my throat out, and finally there will be release. The ranger smiled. But instead she started sniffing the ropes, carefully at first, then more persistently. I felt her breath, heard a soft growl, and then she started to chew. Not on me, on the ropes. That's incredible, Alex couldn't help but say. I couldn't believe it myself, Michael agreed. I thought it was delirium again, but the sensations were too real. I felt the rope loosen with each movement of her jaws. The wolf worked methodically without haste. Sometimes she'd step back, look around, checking for danger, and then return to her task. He paused. I don't know how much time passed, an hour, 2, but at some point I felt I could move my hands. The rope was chewed through. My fingers wouldn't obey. They were stiff from 2 days of immobility. But somehow I managed to reach the gag and pull it out. The first breath of air without the rag in my mouth was— He shook his head. It was like being reborn. Alex listened, holding his breath. Then I somehow untied my legs. My whole body ached, my muscles cramped, but I was free. And the wolf, she sat a few yards from me and watched. Just watched with that same gaze she'd given me 2 years earlier when I saved her from the snares. Michael stood and walked to the window. And do you know what's most amazing? I am absolutely certain she recognized me, recognized the man who had once come to her aid, and now had come to repay that debt. It's a kind of higher justice, not human, natural. And what happened then? The journalist asked. How did you get out of the wilderness? Oh, that was quite the ordeal, the ranger chuckled. I could stand, but walking was almost impossible. My legs wouldn't obey. My head spun with weakness. The wolf watched my struggles for a while, and then she moved towards the forest, looked back, and stopped, as if waiting. Michael returned to the table. I understood that she wanted me to follow her. It sounds fantastic, I know, but at that moment it felt absolutely natural to me. I stumbled after her, holding on to trees, often stopping to catch my breath, and she waited patiently, turning her head, checking if I was coming. We moved like this for about an hour. And where did she lead you? Alex couldn't resist. To water? Michael smiled. To a small stream that ran among the rocks. I collapsed to my knees and drank and drank and drank. Water had never tasted so good. Then I washed my face and hands. I felt a little better. And the wolf? She stood some distance away, waiting. The ranger drummed his fingers on the table. When I had recovered a bit, she moved forward again, and I followed. Another hour or so of walking, and we came out to an old logging road. She didn't go any further. She stopped at the edge of the woods, gave me a long look, and disappeared into the thicket. That was the last time I saw her. And how did you get to People? Alex asked. I followed that road to the village of Oakwood. That's about 10 miles from here. Local residents picked me up there and took me to the hospital in the county seat. I spent almost a month in the hospital. Dehydration, infection, insect bites. There were times when the doctors weren't confident I'd survive. Michael paused. And then there was the investigation, the trial of the poachers. They were found quickly. The forest is vast, but people are few. Everyone knows everyone else. Sam got 3 years probation, and the tattooed one got 5 years in a federal prison. Turns out he already had a record for poaching. When I told the investigators about the wolf, they, of course, didn't believe me. Michael continued with a slight smile. They attributed it all to hallucinations, delirium from fever and dehydration, saying I somehow got out myself in a semi-conscious state. Alex shook his head. But you know it's true. I know, the ranger nodded, and strangely enough, I even like that they don't believe me. This story, it's mine alone, and hers. He fell silent, looking somewhere past the journalist. You know what's the most surprising thing about this whole story? Michael asked unexpectedly. After it happened, I started living again. It was as if something inside me had shifted. The guilt that had gnawed at me for years lessened. It didn't disappear completely, no, but it became bearable. The ranger stood and walked back to the photograph of his wife and daughter. Every day when I woke up, I'd ask myself, why did I survive that accident and they didn't? And I found no answer. But after that story with the wolf, I suddenly understood maybe it was for this, to save her, and then she saved me. The circle closed, you see? Alex nodded. Like some higher purpose? Yes, Michael agreed, and it brought not happiness, no, but peace, acceptance. I stopped asking why and started living. For me, that turned out to be more important than the rescue itself. He returned to the table. After my recovery, I continued to work at the park, but in a different way. Before, it was just a job, a way to escape people, to escape myself. Now, it's a calling. I feel like I'm protecting my home, my family. Every animal in the park is a part of that family. And you haven't seen the wolf again? Alex asked. No, the ranger shook his head. But her offspring, I see regularly. We have 3 wolf packs in the park now, and one of them is her descendants. I recognize them by the distinctive white patch on their chest, a genetic marker, you could say. Sometimes, during a patrol, I feel them watching me from the thicket, not with threat, rather with curiosity, as if they're saying, "We remember you, human. You belong." Alex turned off his voice recorder and carefully put it away in his bag. Thank you for this story, Miss Johnson. It's amazing. The ranger shrugged. As I said, many don't believe it, and you have every right to doubt. You know, the journalist said thoughtfully. "I came here a skeptic. I thought it was just a local legend, a fabrication to attract tourists to the park. But now," he shook his head, "now I'm convinced it all happened just as you say." Michael smiled. "Nature is wiser than us humans, and more just. We forget that, locking ourselves in concrete boxes, surrounding ourselves with technology. But spend just a week in these woods, and you begin to understand how disconnected we humans are from our roots, from real life." Outside, darkness was already falling. Alex had a long drive back to the city ahead. "One more question?" he asked. "A personal one." "Go ahead." The ranger nodded. "Aren't you afraid to live here alone, after everything that happened? After all, the forest is full of dangers." Michael stood, inviting his guest to the door. "I've been to war, lost my family, suffered betrayal, and reborn to life once more. What do I have to fear? Besides," he smiled, "besides, I'm not alone. I have my silent guardians." They stepped onto the porch. The husky, which had been dozing by the entrance, rose and stretched. The sun was already setting behind the trees, painting the sky in fiery orange and crimson. "You should leave before dark," Michael advised. "The road is tricky, easy to get lost at night." Alex nodded, shook his host's hand, and headed for his car. Just as he opened the door, he turned and saw Michael standing on the porch, watching the sunset, with his dog beside him. And at the edge of the forest, in the shadows of the trees, a gray silhouette flickered. The journalist thought he saw a pair of glowing eyes intently watching the ranger's home. Starting the engine, Alex thought, maybe it's true, he's not alone out here. 2 weeks later, the article, "Nature's Debt, An Incredible Story of Rescue," was published in the Evening Star City Gazette. It caused a sensation. Michael received calls from journalists from provincial and even national publications, offering interviews, filming opportunities, and book contracts. But the ranger disappeared again. He went deep into the wilderness of the park, to a hunting cabin where there was no cell service. He would check in via radio once a week to report that everything was fine, and then vanish again. Gradually, interest in his story waned. New sensations emerged, new heroes. The park director, Andrew Stevens, responded to all media inquiries identically. "Mr. Johnson is out patrolling the territory. It's impossible to contact him." Meanwhile, Michael was building a new feeder for the elk at a distant outpost. And when he finished his work and sat down to rest, a wolf emerged from the forest, large, gray, with a white patch on her chest. She stopped 10 paces from him, looked at him with her intelligent eyes, and seemed to nod. Then she slowly disappeared into the thicket. Michael smiled. He knew he was not alone in these woods, and he never would be. When Alex finished writing the last line of the article, he sat for a long time, staring out the window of his city apartment. Out there beyond the glass, the metropolis hummed. Cars honked, neon signs glowed, people rushed somewhere. But he thought of the wilderness, of the forest cabin, of the man with the scar on his cheek, and of the wolf with the white patch on her chest. Maybe, the journalist thought, maybe humanity hasn't lost everything yet. Maybe we can still learn to live in harmony with nature, like Michael. Maybe we all need to sometimes stop and listen, not to the noise of cities, but to the gentle rustle of the forest. And then perhaps we will hear answers to questions we haven't even had time to ask. He closed his laptop and smiled. Tomorrow morning, he was off on a new assignment, to Blue Lakes National Park, where, according to rumors, an old park ranger had saved some bear cubs, and a year later their mother bear had chased poachers away from him. Probably just more tall tales, Alex thought, or maybe not. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps us create even more captivating stories.